All right, thanks, Ty. Well, I'm not seeing anybody. You're seeing me, or you're seeing my slide. So nobody sees anybody. It's great to be here today. I hate the virtual world. I would much rather be doing this in person, but it is what it is. Um, My name, as Ty mentioned, is Jeff Mann, and the talk that I'm going to share with you today is still a work in progress. This is ongoing research that I've been doing the last couple months as time allows, sort of a weekend project, as it were. But it's mapping the MITRE ATT&CK framework to the PCI data security standard. If anybody is interested after the presentation and actually reaching out and contacting me, here's my contact information. Somebody actually called me a couple months ago. They saw a recording of a talk I gave and they took me up on the offer and actually called me. I'm not promoting or endorsing that over any other form of communication other than to say I'm old and that's what I'm used to. But if you want to reach out to me on Twitter or shoot me an email, that's fine. Um, if you're not familiar with who I am, not to dwell on myself, but just to give you a brief glimpse of my background, uh, why I'm doing what I do today. I've been in the information security fields I'm rounding up these days, almost 40 years. 38, I think, is what I would lay claim to. I cut my teeth in the Department of Defense, primarily at the National Security Agency. I did several different things while I was there. Among them, I am a certified cryptanalyst, and as well as it says here, founding member of the Systems and Network Attacks Center, but I'm probably better known for being one of the founding members and developers, pioneers, if you will, of the first NSA Red Team. And we didn't call it Red Team back then, but that's what we know it as today. I've been out in the private sector for almost 25 years now, and primarily working with customers in a consulting advisory capacity in one form or another. Back in the early days, it was convincing people that if they were going to do any kind of business on the internet, they needed to really do security and starting with a firewall and some sort of monitoring or some sort of discovery of what their vulnerabilities were. Um, Somewhere along the line, I ended up in PCI purgatory. I've been doing PCI for pretty much the last 15 or 16 years, ever since PCI was first published, which was in 2004. I actually kind of like PCI. If anybody's ever seen Paul Security Weekly, which I'm a part of, or our new show, which I'm the host of, Security and Compliance Weekly, it's become sort of a drinking game. PCI comes up a lot. I sort of see the world through a PCI lens, and that's primarily, and this will come out a little bit today in our conversation, but I see PCI as basic security. It's the fundamentals, the foundational things that you should do is in any security program, whatever your goals or objectives are. I think I have a slide on that later in the presentation. I can drill into that a little bit more. Lately, I've been doing more getting out and trying to engage our community as I'm getting older, trying to pass on tidbits of wisdom and lessons learned that I've picked up over the years. I do that primarily through the podcast Security and Compliance Weekly and Paul's Security Weekly. And while I'm mentioning it, I should say, if you've not seen or listened to our new show, Security and Compliance Weekly, we've actually just in the last month or so started broadcasting it live. It's typically every Tuesday at 12 noon Eastern time, and you can find it by going to our website, securityweekly.com/live. It's on YouTube. It's all on a bunch of different podcast channels. We're also on a Discord server now, so we actually talk to our listeners and viewers as we're doing the podcast, and that's been kind of fun because we're able to answer questions on the fly because people will drop questions or comments into the Discord channel, and we can interact right there, get that immediate feedback. So that's been kind of cool. So shameless plug, if you haven't already, would love for you to check out Security and Compliance Weekly or any of the shows in the Security Weekly network. So what are we talking about today? If you haven't noticed, MITRE ATT&CK framework has been getting a lot of airplay, media coverage, mentions these days. Maybe I'm a little bit more attuned to it because we do so much talking to vendors and practitioners, through the podcast. But I'm also on mailing lists and the things the chatter I see on like LinkedIn and Twitter and even to some degree Facebook. It seems like MITRE ATT&CK framework is coming up a lot. It seems to be the new thing. And if you've been in this industry long enough, hopefully you've picked up on there's sort of cycles of the new thing or what's the next big thing that we go through. And right now we seem to be, self-quarantining and the world's been shut down. Notwithstanding, MITRE ATT&CK framework seems to have been, the latest next big thing. So I was more or less first introduced to the MITRE ATT&CK framework. I think this episode, it doesn't matter when it happened, it was sometime last fall where we had somebody come on Paul's Security Weekly to talk about the ATT&CK framework, a woman named Katie Nichols. She has since left MITRE, but she was there doing kind of a deep dive on MITRE ATT&CK framework, and it was sort of my first, I guess, deep dive introduction into it. And of course, when I hear about things that I don't know about, I usually have questions. I want to learn more about it, and I also, because I'm trained as an analyst, I tend to pick things apart and look for the flaws and the logic errors, the omissions, the where could things go right, where could things go wrong, stuff like that. So if you go to securityweekly.com, you can find this particular episode. You can go to the YouTube channel and watch it. Just search for episode 612. And we've had other episodes that have featured the MITRE ATT&CK framework probably prior to this and since this. But when I first heard about the MITRE ATT&CK framework, my immediate thought, because I see things through a PCI lens, is sort of what is it? Is it supposed to be a replacement for PCI or any other compliance standards? Is it even a compliance standard? Is it a security standard? What is it? I guess was my first basic question. You can sort of see there's a poster behind Katie's head there, and that's at least at the time, the current mapping or matrix that is the MITRE ATT&CK framework. And if you can sort of begin to tell, it's pretty complex doesn't come through, but there's a lot to it. Let's say it's not something that, as you'll see momentarily, easily fits on a PowerPoint slide, for example. But this is what sort of, when we did this episode, that's sort of what got the idea in my head. I would really like to dig into the MITRE ATT&CK framework and really see what it's all about and how does it play with, relate to, how does it interact with what I'm most familiar with, which is the PCI data security standard. So as I was putting together this presentation, and I will ask for forgiveness because I don't have the ability to sort of read the audience on the fly since I can't see any of you right now. I wanted to start this presentation by just sort of going over some basic terminology. This is sort of a pet peeve of mine in general, but there's words that we use in our industry that we throw around, and we all think we know what they mean. We all have our own idea of what they mean. We assume that everybody else has the same idea of what we mean in terms of definitions. If you're somewhat objective third-party observer, which I try to put myself into that place very often, you might notice that very often this terminology that we are so familiar with often gets used interchangeably as if they're synonymous terms. They get substituted one for another. It's pretty easy to observe objectively that people don't always have the same definitions, don't always have the same perceptions of the meanings of the terms. I am not trying to say that there is a right or absolute definition for any of the terminology that we're about to go over. I want to just at least sort of level set for the purpose of this conversation. Here's at least what the classical definitions are of terminology. And the terminology I'm talking about is based on what I call the basic risk equation, which is something that I learned, gosh, probably almost 30 years ago when I was working for NSA. These are words that we see all and hear all the time. Risk, of course, we put cyber in front of everything now. Cyber risks, vulnerabilities, threats. Countermeasures is how I learned the term. Countermeasures, you could substitute maybe mitigation or remediation, or even I would suggest you could even substitute the term security in the context of this equation. The way I learned these terms was NSA had a glossary of terminology. This is a screenshot that I found online. I actually am holding my original copy of the InfoSec glossary. The one that you're looking at was updated in September 2000. You can see up there the copy that I have. The date of it is June 1992. So I guess I got my hands on it shortly thereafter. So, going on 30 years ago. If you look at the definitions that are found in the glossary that are the official terms and the official definitions, this is the definition of risk that you would find. It's the possibility that a particular threat will adversely impact an information system by exploiting a particular vulnerability. Something can go wrong by one of many ways. Threat then is any circumstance or event with the potential to adversely impact an information system, and so on and so forth. Vulnerability is a weakness in any information system or procedures or controls, anything that could possibly be exploited. And then finally, the idea of countermeasure is what you do to either prevent or contradict or remediate or offset all those things that could be going bad, the threats that can exploit a vulnerability and so on and so forth. So let's now shift gears, and again, I apologize if this is not new to you, but I am starting with sort of a low common denominator, again, mostly to level set and make sure everybody, as much as possible, is on the same page of the same reference point. So let's start looking at the attack framework itself. And again, I apologize if you're already familiar with it. I've looked at it, and I looked at it for many months before I began to really understand it, because as I approached it, it immediately looked kind of complicated and I didn't have the time, so I would move on. This is the actual official definition that MITRE provides about what attack is. And I won't read it to you. I don't believe in that, but I would emphasize that I think what people are excited about in terms of the MITRE attack is that it is capturing not just hypothetical, theoretical attacks and exploits, but actually the attack framework is built around what's happening in the real world that's been detected, that's been hopefully remediated, but it's real world. And if there's a second sort of next big theme that's been bouncing around our industry, at least on the vendor side for the last maybe year or two, it's this idea of we need to be able to prioritize our efforts, whether it's prioritizing our patching programs, if it's prioritizing our vulnerability management programs, if it's prioritizing our resources that we put towards our programs, whatever it is, prioritization is sort of a secondary topic, which is what's been used, from what I have seen, very often to sort of sell or promote attack or it's the reason why vendors are pulling in and saying that they're using the attack framework to try to emphasize that, because this is real world actual things that you are, encountering or might be encountering. This is where you want to start in terms of focusing your attention on protections with limited scant resources and so on and so forth. This is some comments that I found from various vendors and sources, as it were, that are either they're talking about attack, they're trying to incorporate attack into their programs, into their services, into their products. Again, I won't read this to you, and certainly you can go back later and reread the slides when you watch the recording, or simply go to Google and just Google the term, and you can find pretty quickly, because that's what I did, what people are saying about the attack framework. And then in terms of why, I've touched on this a little bit already, but this is what some companies are actually saying about why they're excited or using or trying to incorporate attack into their programs. And I think the bottom line, to oversimplify, I think it has a lot to do with statistical analysis. This is real. It's based on MITRE, which is if you're not familiar with MITRE, they're a nonprofit that's focused on research, and not their only function, but that's a lot of what they do. And it's based on real world activities. So it's not the gloom and doom hypothetical FUD, fear, uncertainty, and doubt that we like to say that we don't like to do. It's hopefully based on, no, this is the real thing. This is the real deal. In terms of what it actually looks like, and this is just a screenshot of their webpage, and again, this is only the tip of the iceberg, as it were. It scrolls down, but if you look across the orange sort of option bar at the top, the MITRE ATT&CK framework is broken up into what they call tactics, and that's what we're looking at here. Tactics being sort of 12, I think there's 12 if you count the gray bar, activities or goals of what attackers are trying to accomplish when they're doing their bad guy attacking activity. So they're categorized, if you will, into and the categories, they call them tactics. There's 12 of them, initial access, persistence, evasion, so lateral movement, so on and so forth. Now, the details that you see in this table are what's called techniques. Techniques being the actual attacks that they're actually seeing out there in the wild. These are real things that are being used by the real bad guys, by the real attackers, that they've categorized and cataloged, and they group them based on what the goal of the attack is, and they call those techniques. Here's again showing a different view of the 12 tactics. Here's just a glimpse. They have a listing of all the techniques, and if you notice the circle there, 12 tactics translates to what they currently have. Current is when I updated this slide or created this slide deck. I can't vouch for it still being current, but I think it's current. 266 attacks or techniques, specific techniques that are contained in the attack framework right now. And then what was most interesting to me, and what piqued my interest initially, at least from having my PCI hat on, is and this was the thought that I had, was simply, okay, so you have all these attacks, but and whether you're a pen test or red teaming company, and you go in and use the attack framework as your methodology, and you have all sorts of success and results, and you go and present those to your customers, at the end of the day, the customer wants to fix the holes, close the gaps, do their mitigations. So how do you fix it? There's a lot of companies that I've seen that are using the attack framework to try to prove that their tools, their monitoring tools, are capable of detecting the attacks, which is fair. But to me, it's being somewhat, I hope, like to think of myself as being pragmatic. The bottom line is, okay, how do you fix it? So I immediately looked at mitigations, and that's what I was most interested in about the attack framework. And it turns out there are 41 mitigations, which necessarily means that they all fall into categories in and of themselves, but there's 41 mitigations that will address each of the 266 attack techniques that are detailed in the MITRE ATT&CK framework. Some other things that MITRE ATT&CK has is they keep track of actual hacker groups. They keep track of specific APTs, and they actually map what these APTs are known for doing in terms of the attack techniques, which is kind of cool, and there's some application there. Not something that I'm focusing on for this talk. But as an example, they've done a couple evaluations. We had a vendor on just in the last month or two on Paul's Security Weekly talking about this particular emulation, which again was kind of a bake-off. They had a lot of different vendors sign up to participate in this exercise, and MITRE was very quick and very adamant about they're not trying to grade or score any of the participants in this exercise, but essentially what it was all these different vendors were launched in a lab, and then they emulated the APT29, all the different techniques that they use, and they kept tabs of who's detecting what, who's detecting different things, who's responding to what they're detecting, and they have it all mapped out in pretty cool ways. This is where I've seen a lot of the application of the attack framework, frankly, is validating your security defenses, validating the security tools and applications and products and systems that you have in place in your network. So that's an example of what they do with MITRE ATT&CK framework. But that's not what I was thinking about. As I said, when I was looking at first encountering the MITRE ATT&CK framework, I was immediately thinking of it in terms of PCI. So, very briefly, and I could spend hours talking about PCI because I'm so passionate about it, and I'm unapologetic about it because I have yet to be talked down from PCI, at least from a standard perspective, as a list of security controls is still pretty solid and is a foundational framework, as it were, for how to build a information security or cybersecurity program for any organization. If you're smart enough to replace whatever data it is that you wish to protect, substitute that data for where PCI talks about specifically credit card data, and you're on the right track. So PCI at the highest level, which is where I like to start when I'm talking about PCI, especially with people that are not familiar with it, it identifies 6 goals, and that is broken up into what they call 12 major requirements. Now, there are many sub requirements that get into the details of how you do these 12 requirements to meet the 6 goals. Depending on how you count it, there's somewhere in the neighborhood of 400 specific controls that comprise the PCI data security standard. That if you're an organization that's a merchant that is accepting credit and debit cards for payment for goods and services, you're supposed to be doing all the 400 things that are mapped out and detailed in the PCI data security standard. Where I have more success with companies either that I'm consulting or I actually used to be the assessor, what's called a qualified security assessor. Did that for many years. When I was working with merchant customers or customers that have to do PCI, I tended to find more success in trying to get them to understand why they should take it seriously, why they shouldn't treat it as a checkbox, why they should dig into it and understand it, by starting with the 6 goals. If you look at these 6 goals, everything that we do in security sort of rolls up into one of these activities. there might be one or two kind of sort of new things these days, given the new technologies and the new way things are done. In the sense that networking has evolved and even the way networks are built has evolved. But the security goals, the security activities really don't change. I was having a conversation yesterday. My current customer that I have is a company that has an offering that is completely cloud-based. It happens to be an AWS, not that it matters. And I had the thought yesterday, all the rules still apply. It's just a matter of how do you meet the security rules, the security requirements in a different context. So it's not a matter of if they apply, it's a matter of how do you do it using a new and different technology. And that's really the trick, and that's what's challenging and new for me, because I'm an old dog trying to learn new ways of doing networking by doing it cloud-based and virtualized and containerized and so on and so forth. But I digress. This is in a nutshell the overview of the PCI requirements. So what I set out to do was, what I was interested in finding out was, I wanted to take the MITRE ATT&CK framework and map it to the PCI data security standard. Very often I've seen when something new comes out like MITRE ATT&CK, I've seen people try to take the old standards and compliance guides and map them into what's new. I wanted to very specifically map the new back to the old, because I have this hypothesis that everything that MITRE ATT&CK is illuminating or enumerating through, highlighting and focusing on the attack techniques, by the time you get to the mitigations, my hunch was, I'll bet you everything that they're recommending for mitigations is probably already in the PCI data security standard. And that's what I wanted to set out to prove. Most people, I think, that have any sort of minimal knowledge of what PCI is about probably know that there's vulnerability scanning and penetration testing requirements of some form that are in the PCI data security standard. And I suspect that if anybody that was trying to just sort of take a casual look at the MITRE ATT&CK framework, which has a lot to do with obviously attack techniques that might be emulated by a pen testing team or a red team or even a blue or purple team, it doesn't matter what the color is, but the good guys trying to do it to learn or to test the strength of a security program. I would think that would be where they would think that MITRE ATT&CK framework applies in terms of the PCI data security standard. The penetration testing requirement specifically happens to be 11.3. There's, as I said, there's sub requirements in terms of doing it external to your network as well as internal to your network. I also cited, just in terms of sort of this, where would most people think MITRE ATT&CK framework fits into PCI, is PCI requires an annual risk assessment, which is typically done as a tabletop exercise, where the idea is you're taking a look at everything that's gone on over the year in terms of in the environment, what, in the wild, what kind of attacks have been, what kind of breaches have been reported, what's new in terms of operating systems and applications and technologies and virtual or otherwise. What are the new vulnerabilities that have been discovered with all these things to look out for. Basically, you're taking an annual look at your program to make sure that you don't need to update it, or you do need to update it based on the changing trends within the industry and the world of cybersecurity. So I think there's a somewhat apparent application of the risk attack framework, because it's real, it's based on real world activity, and it updates periodically. It seems to me that would be a good measure that you apply somehow to your risk assessment program. And that's where I've seen some vendors trying to tap into MITRE ATT&CK framework if they have some understanding or awareness that their customer base might have to do something like follow PCI. And then finally, with incident response, that's where I've seen most activity, frankly, more than red teaming, is the technologies that you have in place, the monitoring tools that you have in place, that you've invested in. Are they capable of detecting the activities that are listed in the attack framework? That's where a lot of the emphasis has been. But as I said, what I wanted to do was focus on the mitigations, and there's 41 of them. This is just a sampling of them, but all of these mitigations are listed within the MITRE ATT&CK framework on their website, and if you click on any one of these, it'll show you every attack technique that it can be addressed, mitigated by applying this particular mitigation. Because again, for me, it's cut to the chase. Companies got problems, they've got holes, they've got vulnerabilities, they want to fix them. Let's make sure that they're doing the fix. And I'll bet you the fix is something that if they're a company subject to PCI, they ought to be doing, should be doing, they're certainly claiming to be doing already. So again, that sort of was my hypothesis. So what I did was I got out my most effective cybersecurity tool, which is Excel, and I listed out all of the different mitigations, as well as a short description of what they are, what they're about, and I ended up doing 3 columns of PCI DSS requirements. So essentially, I wanted to map the mitigation to which particular PCI requirement talks about, addresses whatever the mitigation activity is. And I quickly realized that it may not be a one-for-one, it might be a one-to-many. There might be several PCI requirements that go into satisfying or addressing what any of the particular mitigations were. So there's 3 columns. I probably could get really anal and probably go a 4th and 5th column, but I was mostly trying to prove the point that the mitigations are all in PCI. So I went through that activity. Fortunately, there's only 41 mitigations, so I'm a procrastinator and I put it off, but I finally sat down and did it. And it actually didn't take very long to do. Fortunately, I've been doing PCI for 16 years, and I pretty much know the PCI data security standard by heart, so I could do most of this in my head. Where I had to take the time to look it up in the actual standard is where the numbering might have changed over the years as PCI has evolved and upgraded, updated versions, or I might recall the verse, but I don't necessarily recall the chapter and verse type of thing. So I did have to look up some things. And I will acknowledge that this is my take on it. If there's a future analysis or future research that goes into this project, I would love to have other experts on PCI, other people that do PCI, other QSAs, qualified security assessors, do the same exercise I did and either pool our results or whatever statistical method is best for taking the result of the poll, if you will, to come up with sort of the consensus. Yes, this is addressed, and this is where it's addressed in terms of which single or multiple PCI requirements. But again, for my purposes, I seem to be proving the point because I filled out pretty much the entire table. So let me talk a little bit about the results. First, I'll present the cool pie graph depiction of what my findings were. And basically what I found in terms of what these terms mean, explicit, what I meant by that in terms of if sort of mapping out the results is if there was like a one-to-one relationship, like the mitigation says this, and I'm like, well, there's a PCI requirement that says that. So that's exactly there. I call that explicit. Implicit, therefore, was requirements that the mitigation says to do something, and my feeling was, well, yeah, that's covered by usually in this case one or more PCI requirements, but it's not really just there in black and white. You kind of either have to know what you're doing, or you have to know what it means, or you have to understand the context and the spirit of the law, as it were, for what the PCI requirement is telling you to do. And it's not there black and white, but it's there. So I called that implicit. The third category is what I called need to squint, and those were several mitigations where I could make a case for it's in the PCI data security standard, but because, and the biggest problem was what they were asking in terms of the mitigation was so specific that it was hard to, and I'm willing to argue that, okay, it's not in the PCI standard as it's stated, although what it translates to in terms of an activity, I could kind of sort of argue, if you bear with me, that it's kind of in the data security standard. So we call that in the PCI business squinting, making it work, and hoping nobody challenges us, frankly. The final category, do not mitigate, is actually, there is one of the mitigations, one out of the 41, that simply says, don't mitigate, don't do anything, because the fix is worse than the problem. And I don't know what a specific example of that is, but effectively then there's really 40 mitigations, and there's that one wild card where you don't do anything. So in terms of sort of the raw numbers, my findings were, and I put it out of 40, the number out of 41, just to be explicitly clear. I found that there was 22 of the mitigations that are verbatim, word for word, or close enough that I counted it as explicit. The mitigation is in the PCI data security standard. For the implicit category, I found 13 that, yeah, it's pretty much there. You might not know it because it's not there in black and white and you just can't read it, but what they're asking for is really the element of what's in one or more of the PCI data requirements. And then the need to squint category, there's 5 that I was just like, yeah, I'm having a hard time making them fit, and I'm willing to concede, yeah, okay, maybe not. Some examples of explicit mappings: vulnerability scanning. That's one of the mitigations, and that's a requirement. Antivirus, anti-malware, having password policies, disabling, removing features or programs that are not used when you're building a system. Those are all PCI requirements, and those are also attack framework mitigations. A couple examples of the implicit categories, and the first one I share is Active Directory configuration. The mitigations, perhaps, when it comes to listing this in the attack framework, it might have some specific detail based on what the attack technique is of what you need to configure within the Active Directory. And there's nothing in the PCI data security standard that explicitly talks about Active Directory, primarily because it wasn't around when PCI was first written, but it certainly talks about configuration standards and making sure you have secure configurations for every element of your network, every system and subsystem and system component that's within your enterprise network. So nothing in PCI says Active Directory, but it's certainly implied that you should configure securely everything that you're using. Network segmentation I also listed, and because that's a tricky one, because that's a mitigation. Make sure you segment, isolate your network. But PCI doesn't actually require network segmentation. It strongly advises you that you should and could use network segmentation, but it's not technically a requirement. So I lumped that into the implicit category. Effectively, people have learned that network segmentation is their friend, and they do it in the PCI world to reduce scope and limit the cost of doing security, and in particular the cost of doing their annual PCI assessment, compliance assessment. So that's kind of why they do it. It's a financial thing, but the benefit is it's better to have a segmented network. It makes it harder for attackers to traverse your network, hopefully, in theory. It certainly has helped companies figure out where all their sensitive data was throughout their network and clean up and isolate it into as few a places as possible, which has been a great benefit to these companies, but it wasn't necessarily why they set out to do segmentation in the first place. Anyway, that's the implicit category. A couple examples of the need to squint. The idea of code signing, not really in there, certainly not explicitly, and code signing is kind of a specific thing. PCI talks about doing secure coding and making sure your developers are trained and continue their training. It focuses on OWASP top 10. It focuses mostly on secure program and code development, but it doesn't get into that granular detail. Similar with boot integrity, something that's rather specific that kind of sort of is in PCI, but I had to squint enough that I was willing to put it into this category. And then application isolation and sandboxing is sort of a technique it's a mitigation, I think, mostly for, and this certainly could be argued, but it's meant to slow down or confuse an attacker or make it hard enough for them that either they get detected or they get deterred and move on. And those aren't really the focuses of the way the PCI standard is written as it is. So that's sort of, very brief examples of sort of the rationale that went into how I categorize these things. But again, at the end of the day, if we just round it up, I found that 35 of the 40 mitigations are in the PCI data security standard. So I was a little bit surprised that it wasn't 100%, but I think, what does that translate to? 80, 87%, 88%, pretty darn good. Again, emphasize that it's not necessarily a one-for-one thing, which actually made me, as an assessor, somebody that works within PCI, realize that people that are assessing QSAs, people that are doing advising of how to do security well in the context of PCI, this is sort of one German of an idea that I had is, okay, the attack framework might be a good educational tool to show to my customers why it's important that they put more detail and put more effort into any of a number of PCI requirements that they might gloss over or dismiss or might not think is as important as some of the other requirements. Primary example is that, let me just skip forward a minute to show you the table. I went through and I was curious as to which requirements showed up the most in terms of my charting, my analysis, and this turns out to be the top 5. And this first requirement that I list here, requirement 2.2, which and this is a paraphrase, there's more detail to it, but basically it's develop configuration standards for all your system components. That one requirement was mapping back to the mitigations, and there was 12 mitigations that mapped in whole or in part to what they're really saying is to make sure you have configuration standards, that you've corrected misconfigurations, that the configurations of whatever it is you're using, make sure that they're fixed and that they're secure. I thought that was extremely significant. Nearly 30% of the mitigations that's in the attack framework are addressed by just one PCI requirement. And not only that, but it's not even a technical control within the PCI data security standard. It has to do with documentation. Now, the documentation needs to be based on technical things that you're doing, and it's a written down description of technical controls that you need to put in place or you need to validate. But it's in the world of PCI, I think a lot of people tend to dismiss the soft side, the paper side, the paper trail side. Do you have a written policy? Do you have a written standard? Do you have a written procedure? They're much more focused on, are you doing it? Is the technical control in place? And at one level, I agree with that, because I think pragmatically, that at the end of the day is a better thing to focus on with the limited time that's involved in an assessment. But it's also what creates the common misconception that PCI is a point-in-time assessment if you're only focusing on the technical controls. If you emphasize the softer side, the do you have solid policies and procedures and standards in place, that addresses more of understanding that security is something that you're doing on an ongoing, continuous basis, and not just a point in time because the auditor is coming in next week and you've got to make sure everything's cleaned up. So the top 5 PCI requirements, and I'm actually trying to think about different ways to slice and dice some of the results. But again, I couldn't get off the fact that there was, one requirement that satisfied 30% of the mitigations. In fact, somebody asked me, I gave this presentation as a lunch and learn for my company about a month ago, and somebody asked, well, how many techniques does that map back to? So I went back and counted them up, and it's actually 92 out of the 266 attack techniques are solved by just one PCI requirement. So 34.5% of the attack techniques are addressed. So over a third, just one requirement. I still don't know what that means completely. I'm still sort of contemplating that. I think it's significant, and I think it's something to build off of. But I'm not exactly there yet. I've got several ideas, and I've been bouncing it off of friends and colleagues. Hey, what do you think about this? And I would ask you guys to think about it. What does it mean if there's a compliance standard where one single requirement addresses a full third of the attacks that are described in the MITRE ATT&CK framework, especially keeping in mind that the MITRE ATT&CK framework is based on real world bad guy attacker activity. Like I said, I'm not sure what to do with it, but it intrigues me and wants me to talk about it like I'm doing today with people, just to introduce this concept. The one thing that I have decided is it certainly emphasizes to me that requirement 2.2 is one that should not be overlooked or dismissed or just sort of glossed over and go focus on something else. If anything, it's one that should gain a good portion of scrutiny as an assessor to make sure that my customers and companies that have to follow PCI make sure that they're getting it, because in a real world scenario, that's probably the best thing that they can invest in, is to make sure that they've got solid, decent, current, up-to-date configuration standards for all the systems that they have in their environment. Now, having said that, that's a mouthful. And one of the problems of PCI, and I will concede this, is that all the requirements are treated equally in the context of PCI. There's 400 some controls. If you miss one, you're non-compliant. It's got to be all or nothing. It's 100% pass or fail. And they're not weighted in any way, shape, or form. They're all regarded equally. Whereas the effort that goes into this particular requirement and its sub requirements is a lot of work to make sure that configuration standards are current and they address all the problems that have been seen in the wild and so on and so forth. And that's one requirement compared to a requirement to make sure that your password expires every 90 days, as an example. They're equally weighted in terms of PCI compliance. Certainly the level of effort to meet or satisfy the requirement, way, way different. And I will concede that that's a problem with PCI, but we're working on it, hopefully. Anyway, that's sort of the highlight of my findings. I hope that you find it, if not interesting, at least intriguing. I don't know if there's a way to open up microphones. If anybody wants to ask questions, Ty, I will defer to you. Or if the messages need to be put in chat, if that's the way to do it. But I will stop sharing my screen at this point, and you can see me in all my glory for what I'm worth.
Hey, so it looks like we have more of a statement than a question.
Okay.
And it mentions one requirement maps 34%. Means that PCI DSS is too generic. It makes it too hard to verify compliance because there's too many ways to not meet the requirement.
I don't disagree with that statement. That's where the tool PCI is really, only as effective as the person that's wielding it. And the more skilled you are at using tools, hopefully the more effective you are at making use of it. But I certainly acknowledge that that's an issue. It's funny because I've been having discussions with several people over the last month or so on the various social media platforms. I don't even keep track of them anymore. But I've had some people say that PCI is too prescriptive. It's the most prescriptive compliance standard out there or framework, and therefore it's bad. Where I've had other people say, oh, it's not prescriptive at all. It's nuanced. Requirement 2.2, for example, PCI simply says, make sure you have a configuration standard. It doesn't tell you what should be in it, which I think is where attack framework could help bolster that discussion. All it says is make sure your configuration standard is based on an industry accepted hardening standard, like a CIS benchmark, for example. So many of my customers, they use CIS benchmarks as the basis of their hardening standard. And by basis, very often I mean they're cutting and pasting. They haven't, in my mind, very often gone through the exercise of, I don't know, let's say there's 1,000 controls in the CIS benchmark. They haven't gone through the exercise, or they don't have the skill, frankly, to go through the benchmark and say 452 of these 1,000 suggestions or requirements apply to, I don't know what CIS calls them, applies to our environment, and therefore we should make sure that we're doing these things, and the rest don't really apply, and we don't need to worry about them. And we visit that on a periodic basis and make sure that we're getting it right. PCI doesn't go into that detail. It is not prescriptive from that perspective, and to the degree that a company is actually going through that exercise, is dependent on the assessor, the QSA, coming in and saying, are you doing what the requirement says that you should be doing, or have you done the bare minimum? You've got something that says on the cover sheet that it's a standard, and on page 2 it says reference CIS benchmark such and such. That's what we've based it on. That, frankly, is most of the exercise during the compliance assessment. And yes, I acknowledge that it's missing the point. One of my hopes of this exercise, this research into the MITRE ATT&CK framework, is maybe the attack framework, maybe one of the useful things of the attack framework is to try to hammer home to these PCI customers, as I said earlier, wow, we should be really putting a lot of attention in detail into building our configuration standards, because it's going to solve a third of our problems in a real world attack scenario perspective, which frankly is not what a lot of PCI customers are worried about, because they just want the rubber stamp, they just want the compliance, they want the ROC, the report on compliance, and the attestation of compliance, the AOC, and so they can go back to their day job making money. Any other statements or questions?
Yes, 2 more at least.
Mm-hmm.
One, there's a mention about attack being a lot about detection and prevention, but is PCI okay with not blocking something but detecting it instead?
Interesting question. I want to answer the question as succinctly as possible, and in doing that, I need to ask you to take my word for it to some extent. Having almost 40 years in the business, I think what PCI concedes is that there is no perfect 100% state that an organization or an enterprise is secure and nothing gets in. My proof point is requirement 10, which is all about making sure you have logs turned on everywhere and you're copying them to a centralized log server and you're reviewing them on an ongoing daily basis and alerting and detecting. Part of that is requirement 10 is from the detection perspective, but a good portion of requirement 10 is to make sure that you have the data trail, the forensics trail. And why do you have a forensics trail? Because the attacks, the breaches happen. They want to make sure that you have the evidence so that they can track down the bad guy, or at least track down what the source of the breach was, so that they can fix it. And that's a concession that all the security controls don't completely make 100% secure environment. So in that context, I think I would say that PCI is okay with not closing everything, and that it does rely not necessarily explicitly enough, but it's in there. It's like I said, like 2.2 is not emphasized. The detection and response capability isn't necessarily emphasized enough, but I think InfoSec cybersecurity professionals would mostly all agree that you can't secure everything, and so secure what you can, eliminate the low-hanging fruit, and then make sure your detection capability is up to snuff, which is, again, what Attack Framework, I think, is trying to emphasize, is trying to get companies to hone their skills. If they hire a red team and follow an attack methodology, or the vendors that have all the different detection tools that you would use, they certainly want to see how well they hold up against the attack framework, so they can turn around and sell it to you. So if you're a consumer, you want to buy the best product that's catching the most attack techniques more than anybody else for whatever you can afford to pay. I mean, that's the pragmatic element of this business that we're in. And what was that other question or comment?
Okay, looks like the final question. For those starting out in cybersecurity, in your opinion, is it better to focus on PCI DSS or the attack framework?
Wow, interesting question. Well, my personal belief would be that you should focus on PCI DSS, because it's sort of the whole program, whereas the attack framework is addressing a specific element. You could make the argument that it's better to start off, with one component before you try to take on the big picture. I would argue that it's better to take on the big picture, at least to get the cursory understanding that there's a lot of stuff in play, and then usually the question is in the context of where do I begin, where do I start, I wanted to get into this thing, and my recommendation is expose yourself to as much of this industry as possible, because there's so much that goes into what is known today as cybersecurity. In the hacker world, we tend to lift up and emphasize and glorify, frankly, the red team and the hacker, and we kind of think that it begins and ends there, at least the way you would casually observe that. But that's not all there is. I hate to use sports analogies, especially when we're suffering from not watching sports, but most sports are team games, and most teams have specific roles in terms of positions that the players play. Think a baseball game. Some people are catchers, some people are pitchers, some people are infielders, some people are outfielders. Most people have to hit. Most people play offense and defense. On a football field, there's people that are blockers and tacklers, and there's people that are going to carry the ball, throw the ball, catch the ball, and so on and so forth. Not everybody can be one position and you have a successful team. What I try to recommend to people is expose yourself to everything. Find out what you're either good at or you seem to have some aptitude for learning, and B, find out what piques your interest. One thing might be more exciting to you than another, and it may not be the same thing that your friend is interested in or excited about. But what do you think you're good at, or you think you could be good at? What piques your interest? And in the best of all possible worlds, those things are the same, and that's what I would recommend that people pursue. but you don't get there until unless and until you start with looking at the big picture. That's my recommendation.
Cool, cool. That seems to be all the questions. Jeff, I want to thank you for providing us this presentation. You want to let them know how they can get in touch with you once again?
Twitter handle is at Mr. Jeff Mann, MRJEFFMAN, or if you're government, at Mike Romeo Juliet Echo Foxtrot Mike Alpha November. Yes, I used to work in the DoD. Or the easiest email address is jeff@securityweekly.com, all one word. I'm not hard to find. Google me. I'm out there. I don't
Cool.
hide.
Cool. That's all I have. But if you have anything else you want to say, any parting shots, Jeff?
I would thank you, Ty, for the opportunity to speak. I have been really struggling with the whole virtual conference thing. So the idea that it's a meetup, not that it pragmatically is any different. Appreciate the opportunity to speak. It's sort of, sliding me into this whole idea of doing virtual conferences. I hope we can see each other in person sometime soon. And again, just as a pitch or a promotional opportunity, please check out securityweekly.com. For any of our shows. The flagship show is Paul's Security Weekly. The show that I host, the one that I'm passionate about, is Security and Compliance Weekly. So securityweekly.com is where you start there. Find our Discord server, come on and chat with us while we're broadcasting. I personally love the interaction, which is why I struggle with this virtual environment. I would much rather be hanging out with people. We've done the presentation and we'd go to a bar now and talk shop and talk security for the next couple hours. That's what I wish I was doing. But thank you anyway, Ty. Appreciate it.
For sure. Thank you again, Jeff. And thanks everyone for coming out. And we'll see you in 2 weeks. I think the next presentation will be me as I'm studying for the OSCP. In 2 weeks from now, I'll be giving a presentation on client-side attacks. So it's pretty good segue. And I will be announcing that later on this evening. So look forward to seeing you all in a couple of weeks. Have a great day, everybody.
All right. Bye, everyone. Thanks.